It is 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. You are standing in line outside your local bank, and the line is not moving. At first, you think the system is down. Then you realize the line wraps around the building, then around the next one. Then you hear someone say the ATM on the next street already ran out of cash. You are not here to make a deposit. You are here to pull out your life savings before they become a memory. Yesterday, a carton of milk cost $50. This morning, it costs $150. By tonight, nobody knows. Your phone vibrates. A breaking news alert flashes across the screen. The government has defaulted on sovereign debt. The currency is in freefall. The Prime Minister has resigned. Importers are refusing to release goods without hard currency. Fuel stations are running dry. Pharmacies are rationing medicine. Panic is not arriving. Panic is already in the room. And then, just as the country seems to be slipping from disorder into something worse, a black sedan pulls up outside the Ministry of Finance. Then another, then another. Out step a group of people in tailored suits carrying leather briefcases and calm expressions. They are not soldiers. They carry no rifles. They do not need to. They are the International Monetary Fund, and depending on who you ask, they are either the emergency doctors arriving at the scene of a cardiac arrest, or the debt collectors arriving to inventory the furniture before repossession. That ambiguity is the entire story. Because the IMF is one of the most powerful institutions on earth, and also one of the least mechanically understood. People know the acronym. They know the protests. They know the headlines. Bailout approved, austerity demanded. Currency devalued, riots erupt. They hear words like conditionality, structural adjustment, and special drawing rights as if they are mystical incantations spoken in the glass towers of Washington. But very few people ever stop and ask the obvious question: how does this machine actually work? What happens, step by step, when a country runs out of money? Who gives the IMF its money? Why does one country have more voting power than another? Why do IMF loans come with political consequences that can topple governments? And why is it that, historically, when the IMF arrives to save an economy, the country often emerges from the rescue with less sovereignty than it had before the collapse? In this documentary, we are not going to do the easy thing. We are not going to scream that the IMF is a cartoon villain in a global conspiracy. That explanation is emotionally satisfying, but intellectually lazy. And we are not going to pretend the IMF is a neutral saint, generously distributing economic aid with no agenda. That story is clean, comforting, and also false. We are going to do something harder. We are going to look at the mechanics. We are going to open the hood of the global financial engine and trace the flow of power the same way an engineer traces oil through an engine block. Where does the pressure come from? Where are the valves? Who controls the ignition? What happens when one piston misfires? Because the IMF is not just an institution. It is a system of leverage. It sits at the crossroads of money, politics, and crisis. It was born out of the wreckage of the Great Depression and World War II. Designed to prevent economic collapse from turning into geopolitical catastrophe. In theory, it exists to stabilize the world's economy. In practice, it often becomes the place where nations discover the price of staying inside that system. That price is rarely paid only in interest. It is often paid in policy, in budget cuts, in subsidy removals, in tax reforms written under pressure, in privatizations, in wage compression, in pension cuts, in currencies forced to devalue, in governments compelled to choose between social peace and debt service. This is where the moral argument begins, because every IMF negotiation is, at its core, a collision between two forms of survival. On one side, solvency, the hard arithmetic of paying bills, servicing debt, maintaining imports, keeping the lights on. On the other, sovereignty, the right of a nation to decide how its economy is run, whom it protects, and who bears the pain. When a country has enough reserves, it can pretend those two things are compatible. When a country is broke, it finds out which one comes first. And that is why the IMF provokes such intense reactions. To creditors and finance ministries, it can look like discipline. To ordinary citizens, it can look like an occupation without tanks. To some governments, it is the only bridge between crisis and famine. To others, it is the institution that arrives with a fire hose and then sends the invoice for the water. So before we get into the numbered mechanics of quotas, voting shares, SDRs, lending windows, and debt restructurings, we need to understand the emotional temperature of this institution, why the IMF is not just a bank, and why people in places like Argentina, Greece, Pakistan, Egypt, and dozens of others react to IMF deals as if they are constitutional events. Because in many cases, they are. A commercial bank can repossess your house. A central bank can raise your interest rate. The IMF can reshape an entire country's policy framework. It can force decisions that domestic politicians were too weak, too corrupt, or too afraid to make on their own. Sometimes that prevents total collapse. Sometimes it deepens the suffering. Often, it does both at once. And this is what makes the IMF so difficult to judge honestly. It is not purely a villain. It is not purely a savior. It is the lender of last resort in a world where the last resort is never free. In the next section, we go back to 1944, to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where exhausted wartime allies tried to design a financial order that would stop the next depression, before it became the next war. That is where the IMF was born. And like most institutions born in crisis, it carried the fears of its founders and the ambitions of the most powerful nation in the room. To understand what the IMF became, you have to understand what the world looked like when it was created. July 1944. The Second World War is still raging. Europe is shattered. Asia is burning. Tens of millions are dead, and the old financial order has already collapsed. But in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, inside the Mount Washington Hotel, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered to design something almost absurdly ambitious, a system that could prevent economic chaos from producing another political apocalypse. Because that is what the interwar years had taught them. The Great Depression was not just a stock market crash, it was a chain reaction. Trade collapsed, banks failed, unemployment exploded, governments panicked, countries raised tariffs, devalued currencies, restricted imports, and tried to export their pain to their neighbors. Economists later called these beggar-the-neighbor policies a polite phrase for a brutal reality. If we are going down, we will take your economy with us. And when entire populations became poor, angry, and humiliated, they became vulnerable to men promising national rebirth through force. The delegates at Bretton Woods were not merely drafting financial rules. They were trying to build a firewall between recession and war. At the center of the negotiations stood two men, and the conflict between their visions still echoes in global finance today. On one side was John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, theatrical, and deeply aware that the old European powers were no longer in control. Keynes wanted something close to a true international clearing union, with a neutral global unit of account called the Bancor. His idea was radical in one crucial way. Surplus countries, not just deficit countries, would also face pressure to adjust. In other words, the burden of balance would not fall entirely on the weak. On the other side was Harry Dexter White, representing the United States, practical, strategic, and negotiating from a position of overwhelming advantage. America held most of the world's gold reserves. Its industrial base was intact. Its homeland had not been bombed into rubble. White understood the simplest rule in history. The country with the gold writes the rules. Keynes wanted a more balanced architecture. White wanted an American-centered one. White won. The system that emerged, the Bretton Woods system, placed the US dollar at the center of the world economy. Currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. That made the dollar, in practical terms, the world's anchor reserve asset. But anchor systems require enforcement. If countries could secretly devalue their currencies whenever things got difficult, the whole structure would crack. So the world needed a referee, an institution that would monitor exchange rates, provide temporary financing to countries under stress, and prevent short-term balance of payments problems from becoming protectionist spirals. That referee was the IMF. This original IMF was not yet the monster, savior, or debt enforcer people argue about today. Its initial mission was narrower: exchange rate stability and short-term balance of payments support. If a country had a temporary shock, a crop failure, a commodity price decline, a sudden import bill, it could borrow from the pooled resources of member states instead of devaluing its currency or imposing destructive trade barriers. The design was elegant in theory. Each country contributed money, a quota, into a common pool. In return, if it faced trouble, it could draw from that pool under agreed rules. It was insurance for sovereign states. And here is the first key insight that still matters today. The IMF was never meant to be a charity. It was built as a stabilizer for a system. Its job was not to make every country prosperous. Its job was to stop disorder from spreading. That sounds technical, but it has moral consequences. If your mission is system stability, you can justify causing severe pain in one country if you believe it prevents contagion in 10 others. That logic appears again and again in IMF history, Latin America, Asia, Greece, and beyond. Now, a distinction people often blur. The IMF and the World Bank were both born at Bretton Woods, but they do different jobs. The IMF is the crisis manager, the emergency liquidity institution. The one you call when your country is bleeding foreign reserves and can no longer pay for imports. The World Bank is the long-term lender for development, roads, dams, schools, infrastructure, institutional projects. If your country is having a heart attack, the IMF is the emergency room. If your country is trying to build a healthier economy over 20 years, the World Bank is closer to a rehabilitation program. That distinction matters because the IMF's culture is shaped by crisis. It deals with governments at their weakest moment when they have no time, no leverage, and no cash. That is the perfect environment for conditionality to grow later into one of the most precarious ways. Indeed, one of the most precarious, most alive, most long-lasting color. It deals with long-lasting color. It deals with colorments at the Kaaba. No lively way like to colors, and more levered sellers. No way, you prolets, way release. We release it by way lies it's, with ls it so. By why my laugh. We are it the political lie we sell it, it, by I it, by Billy see you kid it, case it was sakwe to I beludes, kasika dip by I we'd ruse it to the galine it, it's good the cost, tickly bob it, controversial tools in international finance. There was also politics embedded in the architecture from day one. The IMF was headquartered in Washington, D.C., a symbol and a mechanism of influence. By convention, the IMF's managing director would be European, while the World Bank's president would be American. This transatlantic arrangement lasted for decades and became one of the most persistent criticisms from the global South. The institutions claim universality. The leadership was effectively pre-assigned by the same powers that designed the post-war order. And history, being history, added its own irony. Harry Dexter White, one of the principal architects of the American-led system, was later accused and widely believed, based on declassified material, of passing information to Soviet intelligence. So the man helping cement the dollar-centered capitalist order may also have been feeding secrets to its ideological rival. That contradiction is almost too perfect. But then again, global finance is full of contradictions. Institutions built for peace become tools of pressure. Systems designed for stability become engines of moral hazard. Men who build one empire quietly serve another. For roughly 2 decades after Bretton Woods, the system appeared to work. Many advanced economies experienced rapid growth, expanding trade, and relative monetary stability, what some call the post-war golden age of capitalism. Then the arithmetic broke. The United States had issued more dollars abroad than it could credibly back with gold. Foreign claims mounted. Confidence thinned. And in 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The Nixon shock. That single decision shattered the core promise of Bretton Woods. Fixed exchange rates unraveled. Currencies began to float. The IMF's original mission, policing a system of pegged exchange rates, was suddenly obsolete. On paper, this could have been the end of the institution. A relic, a wartime invention that had outlived its purpose. But institutions do not disappear just because their founding problem changes. They adapt, they expand, they reinvent themselves. And the IMF did exactly that. Instead of dying with Bretton Woods, it transformed from an exchange rate monitor into something more powerful and more controversial. the global lender of last resort for sovereign debt crises. That transformation was not immediate, but the conditions were already forming. Floating exchange rates, expanding global capital flows, oil shocks, petrodollar recycling, developing countries borrowing heavily in foreign currencies, Western banks eager to lend. 'Twas a new world, one with more liquidity, more leverage, and much larger explosions when things went wrong. The IMF was about to move from the background to center stage. And when it did, it would no longer be seen as a neutral referee. It would be seen as the institution that arrives when the party is over, the debts are due, and somebody has to decide who gets paid and who gets cut. In the next section, we move from origin story to mechanics, quotas, voting power, and SDRs, the hidden plumbing of IMF power. Because before you can understand IMF conditionality, you need to understand the machine that gives it leverage in the first place. Now we open the machine. Because the IMF does not operate on mystery, it operates on structure. And once you understand that structure, a lot of the politics stop looking accidental. The IMF presents itself as a cooperative institution of member states, and technically, that is true. But in practice, it behaves like a hybrid creature. Part emergency fund, part policy referee, part creditor cartel, and part shareholder corporation. Everything begins with one deceptively bland word: quota. Every member country pays into the IMF according to a quota, which is broadly based on the size and weight of its economy in the global system. Think of quota as a combination of three things at once. It is your contribution. It is your borrowing capacity. And most importantly, it is your voting power. That means the IMF is not one country, one vote like the UN General Assembly. It is more money, more voice. In other words, a sovereign version of cap table politics. The United States contributes the most, so it has the largest voting share. Major European powers and Japan also hold large shares. Rising powers like China have gained weight, but not enough to fully match their economic rise in political influence. Meanwhile, many of the countries that most frequently need IMF loans, low and middle-income states, hold relatively small voting blocs. This is the first mechanical truth of the IMF. The countries most likely to borrow are not the countries most likely to decide the rules. And then there is the famous supermajority threshold. For major IMF decisions, roughly 85% approval is required. Now, do the math. If one country holds a little over 15% of the vote, that country has an effective veto. That country is the United States. So when critics say the IMF reflects American strategic interests, they are not always making an ideological argument. They are often describing a mathematical fact. Nothing major happens without Washington's consent. From the American point of view, this is not a bug. It is the safeguard that prevents the institution from drifting away from the power that underwrites a large part of the system. From much of the global South's point of view, it looks like this: an institution that lectures them about market discipline while remaining structurally governed by post-war power realities. Both interpretations contain truth. Let's move from governance to liquidity. People hear the IMF can lend nearly $1 trillion and imagine a vault somewhere under. Washington stacked floor to ceiling with cash, gold bars, and cold-eyed accountants. The reality is more abstract and, in some ways, more powerful. The IMF's lending capacity comes from pooled member resources, standing arrangements, and one of the strangest instruments in global finance: special drawing rights, or SDRs. SDRs are not a currency in the normal sense. You cannot buy groceries with them. You cannot pay rent with them. They are not used by ordinary people. They are reserve assets, claims that can be exchanged among states for usable currencies. The easiest way to picture an SDR is as a casino chip for central banks. Outside the casino, the chip has no practical daily use. Inside the casino, everyone agrees it represents value. The IMF created SDRs in 1969 because the world needed additional reserve assets beyond gold and dollars. Even before Bretton Woods finally collapsed, policymakers understood that relying too heavily on one country's currency to lubricate global liquidity created fragility. So the IMF did something extraordinary. It invented a synthetic reserve asset. Its value is based on a basket of major currencies, including the US dollar, euro, Chinese renminbi, Japanese yen, and British pound. That basket composition and weighting are periodically reviewed, but the principle is stable. The SDR is designed to represent diversified reserve value, not the fortunes of any single currency. This sounds dry. It is not. Because SDR allocations are one of the few ways the IMF can inject liquidity into the global system at scale, especially during crises. In a global shock, financial panic, pandemic, sudden capital flight, the IMF can allocate SDRs to member countries. Those countries can then exchange SDRs for hard currencies like dollars or euros to pay for imports, stabilize reserves, and avoid immediate collapse. In effect, the IMF can create reserve liquidity without printing money in the conventional national sense. And that is where the politics returns, because SDRs are allocated according to quotas. So when the IMF creates a huge allocation during a crisis, richer countries with larger quotas receive the largest shares automatically, even if they do not urgently need the liquidity. Poorer countries, which may be facing food shortages, debt distress, or currency collapse, receive much smaller shares. This is one of the most criticized design features in the system. The IMF's defense is straightforward. Quotas reflect contribution and systemic weight, so allocations follow the architecture of the institution. Critics respond. In a global emergency, the architecture reproduces inequality precisely when the world claims it is trying to relieve it. Both statements can be true at the same time, and that is the IMF in one sentence. Now we come to the part people feel most viscerally: the loan. When a country approaches the IMF, it is usually not because options are plentiful. It is because options are disappearing. Reserves are falling. Bond yields are exploding. Imports are at risk. The currency is collapsing. Politicians have run out of time and are about to run out of legitimacy. This is when the IMF's leverage becomes real. An IMF arrangement is not just a wire transfer. It is a negotiated program. And that program comes with conditions written into policy commitments, often through a letter of intent and related technical documents. This is where the institution moves from liquidity provider to economic co-author. The IMF will say, if we lend you money, we need a credible path showing how your balance of payments crisis will stabilize and how debt sustainability will improve. In principle, that is rational. If a country is broke because it keeps spending beyond its means, printing money uncontrollably, maintaining impossible subsidies, or suppressing exchange rate adjustments, a loan without reform can simply postpone, collapse, and enlarge the final bill. But rationality at the spreadsheet level can become brutality at street level, because reform in IMF programs has often meant some combination of fiscal austerity, subsidy cuts, tax increases, currency devaluation, higher interest rates, privatization of state assets, and liberalization of trade and capital flows. The IMF calls this conditionality. In much of the developing world, many people remember it by another name: structural adjustment. The intended logic is medical. The economy is ill. The medicine is painful but necessary. Stabilize the currency. Restore investor confidence. Reduce deficits. Rebuild reserves. Create conditions for growth. The lived reality, however, often feels less like medicine and more like emergency surgery performed without anesthesia. Cut fuel subsidies and transport costs jump. Transport costs jump and food prices rise. Food prices rise and urban unrest spreads. Raise interest rates to defend the currency and indebted firms collapse. Cut public payrolls and unemployment spikes. Privatize utilities too fast, and citizens suddenly pay more for water, electricity, or transport while foreign investors purchase strategic assets at crisis prices. None of these outcomes are theoretical. They are the reason IMF programs become political flashpoints. To be fair, and this matters, the IMF is not always forcing reform onto innocent governments. Many countries arrive at the IMF after years of domestic mismanagement, corruption, patronage, spending, weak tax collection, exchange rate fantasies, or debt-fueled populism. In some cases, the IMF becomes the external actor willing to say what domestic elites refuse to say. The numbers no longer work. And that is why IMF programs so often have a double function. They provide cash. They also provide political cover. A government can tell its citizens, "We had no choice. The IMF demanded it." Sometimes that is partially true. Sometimes it is a convenient lie. Usually, it is both. So now the machine is visible. Quotas create power. Power shapes liquidity. Liquidity creates leverage, and leverage is converted into policy through conditionality. That is the model. In the next section, we'll test this model against history, where the theory collides with real societies. Latin America's lost decade and the Asian financial crisis, the moments that built the IMF's reputation as both firefighter and arsonist. The IMF's reputation was not built in theory, it was built in crisis. And crisis is where institutions reveal what they really are, not in mission statements, not in annual reports, but in the decisions they make when there is not enough money, not enough time, and too many people about to suffer. If you want to understand why the IMF is feared in so many countries, you have to begin in Latin America in the 1980s, the decade that turned the fund from a distant institution into a household name, often spoken with resentment. During the 1970s, international banks were flooded with petrodollar surplus cash from oil exporting countries that had to go somewhere. Western banks recycled that money into loans across the developing world, especially Latin America. Governments borrowed heavily: Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others. Some of the money funded real infrastructure. Some funded patronage. Some simply disappeared into the usual black holes of power. As long as interest rates stayed low and export revenues held up, the system looked sustainable. Then Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve raised U.S. interest rates aggressively to crush inflation. Because much of the debt was dollar-denominated and tied to global rates, debt service costs for Latin American borrowers exploded. At the same time, commodity prices weakened and local currencies came under pressure. Suddenly, governments that had looked solvent on paper were bankrupt in reality. Mexico's 1982 debt crisis became the signal flare. Then the region followed, and the IMF arrived. This is where the mythology of the IMF as global loan shark really hardened. The fund and its allies stepped in with financing packages, but the financing came with programs designed to restore fiscal balance and external sustainability. Spending cuts, devaluations, tight money, liberalization, privatization, the standard toolkit. From the IMF's perspective, this was stabilization. From the perspective of millions of citizens, it was social compression on a historic scale. The decade that followed became known in Latin America as the lost decade. Growth collapsed. Inflation surged in several countries. Real wages were crushed. Poverty rose. Public services deteriorated, and many people concluded, not irrationally, that the IMF's programs had prioritized repayment to foreign creditors and ensued protection of Western banks over the well-being of domestic populations. That criticism is not the whole story, but it is not propaganda either. The IMF was operating inside a system where avoiding a broader banking collapse in New York and London was a strategic priority. In practice, that often meant crisis countries were rescued so they could keep servicing external debts. The burden of adjustment fell on ordinary citizens, while the architecture of international finance remained intact. This is where the IMF's legitimacy problem deepened. Even when the arithmetic behind adjustment was real, the distribution of pain looked political. Then came Asia, 1997. And this crisis mattered because it exposed a different weakness, not just harshness, but diagnostic failure. The Asian tigers had been celebrated as developmental success stories: high savings, strong export growth, industrial upgrading, disciplined states. But beneath the success were vulnerabilities, private sector overborrowing, currency mismatches, fragile financial systems, and heavy exposure to capital flows. When Thailand's baht came under speculative attack and eventually broke its peg, panic spread across the region. Investors fled not only Thailand, but also Indonesia, South Korea, and beyond. It was contagion, a liquidity crisis turning into a systemic one. The IMF stepped in again. But many critics argue that the fund treated Asia as if it were Latin America all over again. It prescribed familiar medicine: fiscal tightening, high interest rates, structural reforms, confidence restoration through orthodoxy. In some places, that response worsened the collapse. High interest rates strangled indebted firms. Bankruptcies spread. Output contracted violently. In Indonesia, the economic and political breakdown became severe enough to contribute to the fall of Suharto. The crisis was not merely financial anymore. It became constitutional, social, and geopolitical. This was the moment many Asian policymakers internalized a lasting lesson. Never depend on the IMF in your most vulnerable hour if you can avoid it. So they built insurance of their own. Countries across Asia accumulated massive foreign exchange reserves, especially dollars, as a self-protection strategy. Better to hoard reserves for a decade than negotiate conditionality in a week. That reserve accumulation shaped the global economy for years afterward, including trade imbalances and demand for U.S. assets. In other words, the IMF did not just manage crises. Its behavior changed how countries prepared for the next one. Then Europe delivered another chapter in irony. Greece. By 2010, after the global financial crisis that began in the United States, Europe found itself confronting a sovereign debt crisis inside the Eurozone. Greece revealed that its fiscal statistics had been badly misreported. Investors panicked. Borrowing costs surged. Default loomed. The response came through the so-called Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. What followed became one of the most controversial bailout episodes in modern economic history. Greece received huge support packages, but the conditions were crushing. Wage cuts, pension reductions, tax increases, public sector layoffs, and a prolonged austerity regime. Since Greece used the euro, it could not devalue its own currency to regain competitiveness. So adjustment was forced internally through prices, wages, and domestic demand. The result was devastation. Mass unemployment, youth unemployment at catastrophic levels, a deep contraction in GDP, social despair, political radicalization. And then the central question emerged. Was this really a bailout of Greece, or a bailout of the European banking system, especially banks in creditor countries that had lent recklessly and were now being protected from a disorderly default? A large share of funds flowed through Greece back to creditors. That fact became a symbol of everything critics hated about crisis management in the post-2008 era. Private gains in the boom, public pain in the bust. To its credit, even the IMF later acknowledged major forecasting mistakes, including underestimating the damage caused by austerity in a collapsing economy. That matters because it reveals something uncomfortable and human beneath the institution's technocratic image. The IMF can be powerful and still be wrong. Very wrong. And yet, even after Latin America, Asia, and Greece, the story does not end with IMF bad, because the world changed again. The IMF's old monopoly began to crack. The first challenger was not ideological, it was practical. China. For decades, if a country ran into trouble, it usually had to negotiate with Western-led institutions and creditor groups. Then China expanded its global lending footprint through bilateral finance and infrastructure deals, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative. To many governments, China offered something the IMF rarely did: money without long lectures about governance, subsidies, democratic norms, or macroeconomic orthodoxy. The pitch was simple. You need a port, rail line, power plant, or road. We finance and build it. To supporters, this was overdue infrastructure capital. To critics, it was strategic leverage wrapped in concrete. Cases like Sri Lanka's Hambantota port became symbols, sometimes oversimplified ones, of fears about debt trap diplomacy. The reality is more complex than the slogan. Not every Chinese loan is predatory. Not every failed project is a trap. Many debt crises involve private bond markets, domestic policy failures, and multiple creditors. But the effect on the global system is undeniable. China changed the negotiation landscape. And that created a new problem for the IMF. Sovereign debt restructurings now involve a more fragmented creditor map. Western bondholders, multilateral institutions, Paris Club governments, Chinese policy banks, state-owned lenders, commercial lenders, and others, all with different incentives. Getting everyone to accept losses or haircuts has become slower and harder. Meanwhile, crisis countries wait in limbo. So the IMF now often plays not just lender and enforcer, but mediator in a fractured debt order. And then, from a completely different direction, came a challenge that was as much symbolic as financial: Bitcoin and the El Salvador experiment. When El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender in 2021, the move was treated in many policy circles as reckless spectacle. The IMF warned about financial stability, consumer protection, monetary integrity, and volatility. Those concerns were not invented. They were real. But the political significance of the move went beyond Bitcoin itself. It was a small country signaling that it wanted room to maneuver outside the traditional architecture. Whether one sees that as innovation, gambling, or propaganda, it highlighted a deeper shift. Countries now have more ways to resist or bypass old forms of monetary discipline, at least temporarily. China's capital, crypto's parallel rails, regional lenders, domestic improvisation. None fully replaces the IMF. But together, they weaken its monopoly on desperation. And when an institution loses monopoly power, its authority changes. It can no longer rely only on rules. It must compete on credibility. Which brings us to the most revealing modern case of all, the country that returns to the IMF again and again. Not because it loves the institution, but because it keeps colliding with the same economic constraints. Argentina. In the final section, we look at the IMF's longest-running toxic relationship, the Argentina cycle, and then step back to answer the real question. Is the IMF a firefighter, an arsonist, or the unavoidable symptom of a world financial system built on unequal power and recurring crisis? If the IMF were a long-running drama, Argentina would be the character everyone recognizes immediately. Not because it is simple, but because it is tragic, brilliant, self-destructive, politically theatrical, and impossible to ignore. Argentina's relationship with the IMF is not a one-time rescue story. It is a recurring cycle: reform, relief, relapse, inflation, devaluation, blame. Renegotiation repeated so often that it begins to feel less like diplomacy and more like addiction. Since the mid-20th century, Argentina has entered into IMF programs again and again. Each one presented as a turning point. Each one shadowed by the memory of the last. And no episode captures the mechanics of modern IMF failure better than the 2018 program. President Mauricio Macri, facing a collapsing peso, vanishing confidence, and mounting capital flight, turned to the IMF for help. The fund approved what became the largest package in its history, a headline-sized commitment meant to shock markets back into confidence. The message was clear. The IMF was going big enough to stop the panic. But money alone does not fix a credibility crisis when the political economy underneath remains unstable. A large portion of the inflow effectively helped finance capital flight. Wealthier actors converted pesos into dollars and moved money out while confidence evaporated. The state absorbed the burden. The public absorbed the inflation. And the IMF was left, once again, tied to a program whose economic logic existed on paper but whose political reality was leaking out through every crack in the system. This is one of the darkest recurring patterns in sovereign crises. Public debt becomes the bridge over which private capital escapes. Then the public is told to accept austerity to repair the bridge. By the time the 2018 program unraveled, Argentina was back in familiar territory: high inflation, a collapsing currency, social anger, and another chapter in the argument over whether the IMF had been naive, complicit, or simply trapped by its own incentives. Because that is the part many people miss. When the IMF lends huge sums to a large, politically important borrower, it does not just gain leverage over that country. It also becomes exposed. If the program fails, the borrower is in crisis, but the fund's credibility is on the line too. In extreme cases, the IMF can become less like a detached disciplinarian and more like a nervous creditor praying the debtor somehow stabilizes. That is the paradox of power in global finance. The stronger institution often appears dominant at the negotiation table. But after the money is dispersed, everyone is chained to outcomes they cannot fully control. Then came Javier Milei, a political outsider with a chainsaw-ass campaign symbol. Milei entered office promising shock therapy, spending cuts, and war on Argentina's old economic habits. In another era, the IMF would have been the institution pushing a reluctant government toward austerity. In this case, the new government often moved faster and more aggressively than the IMF's own program language, and suddenly the script flipped. The IMF was no longer just the villain imposing pain. It was also the institution trying to manage the risk of a domestic experiment so radical that even seasoned technocrats were forced into a strange position. Hoping a politically explosive adjustment would work, because the alternatives were default, renewed populist spirals, and a much larger institutional failure. Argentina reveals something essential about the IMF. The fund is not an all-powerful puppet master. It is a crisis actor operating inside broken national political systems, global capital volatility, creditor politics, and social limits. It can influence policy, it can delay collapse. It can impose conditions, but it cannot manufacture trust, legitimacy, or productive capacity from a spreadsheet. And that brings us to the verdict. So what is the IMF, really? Firefighter or arsonist? The uncomfortable answer is both, and sometimes neither. The case for the firefighter: without a lender of last resort at the sovereign level, many crises would become humanitarian disasters even faster than they already do. When countries run out of foreign currency, this is not an abstract market event. It means fuel shortages, medicine shortages, food import disruptions, and cascading institutional breakdown. In fragile states, that can mean unrest, state collapse, forced migration, or war. In that sense, the IMF is the emergency room of global capitalism. It is not pretty, it is not gentle, and the doctors often have terrible bedside manner. But when the patient is hemorrhaging reserves and creditors are running for the exits, the IMF may be the only institution that can mobilize financing quickly enough to stop the immediate bleeding. And yes, tourniquets hurt. The case for the arsonist: but the IMF is not a neutral clinic floating above politics. It was built in a world shaped by post-war power, and that architecture still matters. Voting shares, veto thresholds, leadership conventions, and creditor influence all shape what kinds of rescues are possible and whose interests are protected first. It often demands fiscal pain from populations that did not design the policies that caused the crisis. It has repeatedly supported programs that shielded financial systems and major creditors while distributing adjustment costs downward. It does not always create the fire, but it has often poured accelerant on economies already burning, then described the smoke as necessary stabilization. That is why the IMF inspires both dependence and hostility. It is the institution countries call when they have no good options left, and the institution many citizens blame when those options become even more painful. What has changed now? The future may be even more complicated than the IMF's past. The world that created the fund in 1944 no longer exists. Power is more fragmented. The global south is more politically assertive. Debt is spread across a wider, messier creditor landscape. China is a major lender. Regional blocs have alternatives. Private bond markets react faster than governments. Crypto, whatever one thinks of it, has normalized the idea that monetary systems can be challenged from outside traditional state institutions. The IMF no longer has a clean monopoly on crisis management, but that does not mean it is irrelevant. It means it is entering a more dangerous phase, a world where it still carries enormous responsibility, but with less control, less deference, and more competitors who can lend money without sharing losses or rules. In a fragmented debt order, the IMF may remain the institution everyone complains about and still the one everyone eventually needs in the room. That is not a sign of moral purity. 'Tis a sign of structural necessity inside an unstable system. Why this matters beyond economics, people? It is easy to watch all of this and think, this is sovereign debt drama, central bank jargon, elite policy warfare. It has nothing to do with my life. But that illusion is one of the luxuries of stability. When a major importer devalues, supply chains shift, prices move, commodity markets react, migration patterns change, elections in distant countries harden, risk premiums rise, banks adjust exposure, governments reprice debt, capital moves. And eventually, the effects reach households far from the original crisis: fuel prices, jobs, interest rates, taxes, or politics. The global economy is not a set of separate national stories. It is a pressure system. The IMF sits in the middle of that pressure system, trying to keep cracks from becoming fractures. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it fails. Sometimes it preserves the system by sacrificing fairness. Sometimes it buys time for reforms that domestic elites should have made years earlier. Sometimes it merely socializes losses and postpones the next collapse. And maybe that is the most honest conclusion. The IMF is not the solution to global inequality. It is not the source of every crisis. It is the institution that appears at the exact point where arithmetic, power, and politics stop pretending they can coexist peacefully. It is what the system sends when the bill comes due. So the next time you see a headline about a sovereign default, a bailout package, or an IMF mission arriving in some capital city, do not scroll past it as if it were somebody else's problem. Read it closely. Because now you understand the machinery: quotas, votes, SDRs, conditionality, creditor politics, and the choreography of crisis. You understand that when a nation signs an IMF deal, it is not just borrowing money. It is negotiating over who absorbs the shock. And in the game of global finance, the people who do not understand the rules are usually the ones paying for them.